History isn't written by the victors in the wasteland. It's written by those still breathing when the silence settles. And sometimes, the ones who stood the longest are the first to be forgotten. They called themselves outcasts, but that wasn't their crime. Their real sin was remembering what the Brotherhood of Steel was meant to be. In a world drowning in need, they chose discipline. In a time crying out of compassion, they chose isolation. Most called them heartless, others dangerous. But if you strip away the ideology, you're left with something far more tragic. Men and women who believed too hard, who refused to evolve, who walked into exile with heads high, not because they were wrong, but because they refused to bend. This isn't the story of heroes or villains, it's the story of those who chose principle over people, steel over sympathy, the last true echoes of a brotherhood that the world no longer wanted. This is the story of the outcasts, the ones who remembered and were forgotten. The Brotherhood of Steel was born from catastrophe, not out of kindness, but fear. Its founders saw what humanity had done with unchecked power, and they made a vow, never again. They became zealots, archivists of annihilation, guardians of technology too dangerous to trust in the hands of the desperate. For years, the Brotherhood operated as a closed fist, punching through ruin to retrieve the relics of the old world. Every laser rifle recovered, every terminal secured, every microchip buried beneath a mountain of doctrine. But in the capital wasteland, a strange thing happened. Elder Lyons, once a loyal scribe of the Midwest chapter, looked into the eyes of the people, and he didn't see threats, he saw victims. He began protecting caravans, sheltering the sick, deploying Brotherhood might to defend the hopeless instead of hoarding the past. To many, he became a savior. To others, a heretic. Among the dissenters stood Paladin Henry Keston. Decorated, feared, and respected. He didn't hate Lyons. He mourned him, because Lyons had become something dangerous. A man of mercy in a world that punishes it. Keston didn't defect. He defended the codex, the mission, the very soul of the Brotherhood as it was written. And with him walked those who felt the same. They weren't traitors. They were the faithful. And so they became outcasts, not by choice, but by necessity. They chose exile over compromise, isolation over betrayal. And in doing so, they carved a new identity, not in blood, but in principle. It wasn't a fortress in the traditional sense. There were no flags, no public calls for unity. Fort Independence stood like a tombstone on the DC skyline. Cold, uninviting, absolute. Here, the outcasts made their stand, not with declarations or banners, but with silence. A silence that spoke louder than any broadcast. The base itself was utilitarian. Concrete bones, steel veins. It wasn't built to welcome. It was built to endure. Like the men and women inside it. Their armor told a story. Black painting, red accents, a visual snarl to the soft white and gold Lyons men wore. Theirs wasn't symbolism, it was defiance made visible. Inside those walls, the outcasts built nothing for the wasteland. No farms, no clinics, no trade posts. What they built was order. What they guarded was purpose. They didn't smile, they didn't explain. You approach Fort Independence not as a guest, but as a test. If you had no tech to offer, you were nothing. If you had no weapons to trade, they didn't thank you. They cataloged them, and then they turned away. To most, it felt heartless. To the outcasts, it was clarity. They weren't here to rebuild, they were here to preserve. It's easy to call them cold, and they were. But what makes the outcasts compelling isn't their cruelty, it's their refusal to compromise. The Brotherhood's creed has always been one for containment. Keep dangerous tech from the hands of those who would misuse it. It wasn't a hypothetical fear. That was the old world, a planet incinerated by its own inventions. And so the outcasts saw every softening of that mission as a step back towards the fire. Help a village today? That village might dig up a fusion core tomorrow, build a clinic for the sick. What happens when someone steals the stim packs and reverse engineers the tech inside? The outcasts didn't believe in intent. They believed in outcomes. And to them, compassion led to corruption. They would rather see 1,000 people suffer in ignorance than let one power cell fall into the wrong hands. That choice sounds monstrous, but it also sounds familiar because Fallout has always asked a terrifying question. What are you willing to become to stop the next apocalypse? For the outcasts, that answer was simple. Whatever it takes. Even if that means being hated, even if it meant being the enemy in everyone else's story, they didn't need the world to agree with them. They just needed the mission to survive. And in the cold corridors of Fort Independence, where footsteps echoed like judgment, they cling to that belief with the grip of dead men holding onto the past. In 2277, the outcasts discovered a piece of the past that hadn't crumbled yet. A simulation, locked inside a military facility like a relic trapped in amber. Operation Anchorage. It wasn't just a trading tool. It was a key. Behind the virtual battlefield lay an untouched weapons cache. Power armor, tech, weapons the world hadn't seen since the bombs fell. But they couldn't access it. The security system required someone to complete the simulation firsthand. A neural sync, a mental test of loyalty and combat instinct. And so, they reached out, not to an ally, not to a fellow soldier, but to you, the lone wanderer. Not out of trust, not out of necessity. You weren't a companion, you were a trigger, a keycard made of flesh and memory. What followed was a haunting reenactment of a war that never truly ended. You walk through frost-bitten canyons, beneath red banners of the People's Republic, and watch men die in echoes of patriotism that had long since turned to dust. When the simulation ended, the vault opened, and the outcasts stepped forward. They didn't cheer, they didn't rejoice. They took the gear, logged the data, and returned to their silence. Because that's what mattered. The mission, the tech, the memory of what once had made the world strong and dangerous. And helping them, you didn't become their friend. You became a ghost in their machine, a necessary variable in the pursuit of perfect preservation. And once you've served your purpose, they move on. The outcasts never asked to be remembered, but in many ways, they became a symbol far more powerful than they intended, a mirror for the cost of uncompromising belief. Every choice they make, every patrol route, every refusal to help a dying settler, every relic buried in steel crates beneath Fort Independence was a tribute to discipline, but it came at a cost. They didn't just isolate themselves from Lyons, they isolated themselves from the world, from purpose beyond preservation, from people who might have needed them, not as relic hunters, but as protectors. The Brotherhood under Lyons grew. It adapted, it built alliances, it helped bring clean water to the wasteland, and the outcasts, they held their posts, they followed the codex, and eventually, they were left behind. That's the price of never bending. of standing so still that history forgets to write you in. But maybe that was the whole point. Maybe, to the outcasts, irrelevance was a badge of honor. Better to fade away with your mission intact than to survive by betraying your core. In that sense, the outcasts are a tragic reflection of Fallout's greatest question. Can a man or a faction exist without changing in a world that demands transformation to survive? They were not warm. They were not wise, but they were faithful. Even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. And in that quiet resolve, they became something rare. Not heroes, not villains, but symbols. Of stubbornness, of sacrifice, of the brutal purity that comes from living by a code that doesn't care whether the world loves you or not. They didn't fall. They froze, preserved, like the very tech they protected, in amber and armor, in silence. And maybe that's what makes them unforgettable after all. By 2283, the world had changed again. The capital wasteland was no longer a battlefield of scattered ideologies, but a crucible reshaping its survivors. Out of the dust rose a new elder, Elder Maxson, young, charismatic, and forged in the myths of both East and West. To some, he was the bridge between generations. To others, a weapon dressed in civility. But what Maxson understood better than anyone was the value of unity. Not peace, but purpose. He didn't extend an olive branch to the outcasts. He extended a banner, the Brotherhood's banner, forged in steel, rooted in tradition, sharpened by war. And in that banner, the outcasts saw what they had been waiting for all along. Recognition not as renegades, but as keepers of the faith. Maxson brought them back, not through mercy, but alignment. His brotherhood wasn't Lyons' brotherhood. It wasn't about charity. It was about strength, order, and control, the very tenets the outcasts had bled to preserve. So, they rejoined, quietly, without ceremony. The red and black faded beneath standard issue steel once more, the names absorbed into the new chain of command, their legacy folded into the greater machine. But if you listen closely in the halls of the Pridwin, or walk through the ruins of Fort Independence, you can still feel the echo, a reminder that some brotherhoods didn't fall. They simply waited, locked in silence, holding onto a creed the world had abandoned, until the world came back around. And when it did, the outcasts were ready, not for glory, not for gratitude, but for the only thing they ever wanted, the mission. And maybe that's the strangest thing of it all. They weren't lost, just patient. Corn out.